Hi, my name is Murphy Griffin, and welcome to episode 20 of Neophyte Boatwrights. In this episode, I'm going to be discussing traditional paint making practices and putting the first coats of primer on my boat. So let's get to it. So in preparation for framing out the hull, I need to first paint the interior at least with a priming coat before I put the frames down on the cedar planks. I could of course go buy store-made paint, but that would be pretty expensive, especially considering the size of the boat I'm building. So instead, I'm going to use some of my newly formed skills in DIY paint making to make paint for the boat. So I'm going to essentially be using the same procedure and ingredients that we use at the wheelwright shop at Colonial Williamsburg. So that's going to consist of boiled linseed oil and pigment. The most straightforward recipe for oil-based paint is simply an oil as the vehicle and a pigment as the colorant ground together rather aggressively to create a paint. So in order to make the grinding process more efficient and less laborious, I've borrowed a friend of mine's 19th century paint mill. So this is basically like a coffee grinder or a tabletop grist mill that you might have at home. You load the ingredients into the hopper, you turn the crank, it grinds the two ingredients together, pulverizing the pigment granules even finer so they mix with the oil better, and it drops into a small quart jar here. So as I said, I'm using boiled linseed oil as the vehicle of my oil paint, and while it is always best to use as high grade of an oil as you can when making paint, because I have to make such a large volume of paint, I just went down to the hardware store and bought a big gallon of boiled linseed oil. For pigment, at least for the primer coat, I'm using two different ingredients. One is something called zirconium silicate, which is a very common white pigment, and it's used in industrial processes like the glazing of ceramics and stuff like that. This is going to be the main ingredient for the color. I'm also mixing in zinc oxide. Now this stuff is more expensive. It's a brighter white than the zirconium silicate, but it has antifungal properties. So I want to use a little bit of this just to help protect the hull in the course of being used in, say, fresh water. So let's give it a go. So I'm mixing the zirconium silicate and the zinc oxide in a 4-to-1 ratio. So that means 4 scoops of the zirconium silicate to every 1 scoop of zinc oxide. I'm then fairly conservative with the boiled linseed oil. It's much better to mix the paint too thick than too thin. If you need to thin it out later, you can always add more oil. I then do a very cursory premix before loading it in the paint mill. After a few adjustments, I can just start cranking away and making paint. All in all, it took me about 2 hours to make 1 gallon of paint. On and on I go. It's standard procedure before painting a wood surface to thoroughly sand it, smooth it, and clean it. So I sanded the boat, wiped it down with mineral spirits, and got to work. So I'm actually leaving two pairs of planks unpainted. The top or sheer planks I'm finishing bright with some varnish, and here you can see me rubbing some boiled linseed oil on it just to condition it. And then the bottom or garboard planks I'm going to first finish with a penetrating epoxy just to help strengthen and protect those planks since they're so susceptible to getting injured in use. And then I'll finally paint them. With the single gallon of paint, I was able to get 2 complete coats on both the inside and the outside of the boat, which shows you why it's worth it to make homemade oil-based paint. You really get a lot of mileage out of it. It's worth mentioning that for best effect, it's advisable to apply lots of thin coats of oil paint so that it has time to cure and that you get a nice sheen. All in all, I was very pleased with the performance of the paint I made and look forward to making the finish coats for the boat. Alright, so that's it for episode 20. I really hope you enjoyed it. Stay tuned for episode 21 where, with the help of one of my patrons, I'll be finally installing all the ribs in the hull. So as always, please consider liking this video, commenting, following this channel, and if you're so compelled, perhaps becoming one of my patrons on my Patreon page. So with that being said, I wanted to give a quick shout out to some of my newest patrons. Much thanks to Sylvia, John Young, Tim, Jan Skaken, and Matthew Mueller. And then finally, a big shout out to my buddy Andrew Delisle, who lent me the 19th century paint mill that you saw in this episode. Andrew is a spectacular craftsman, and if you don't already, you should check him out on Instagram at Country Wheelwright. So again, thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time. Hi, and welcome to the Wheelwright shop at Colonial Williamsburg. In this video, I just want to give you a quick demonstration on how we go about making paint to finish the vehicles that we build here in the shop. So let's check it out. So it all starts with a flat marble slab. This will serve as the work surface for the making of the paint. The tools of the trade are a measuring spoon, some palette knives, and a muller, which is a stone that is used for grinding the paint. The key ingredient is the colorant or pigment. In this case, what you're looking at is French yellow ochre, an earth-based pigment. So you mound the pigment in the middle of the stone, make a convenient little divot to receive a puddle of oil. Then, using the palette knives, you mix the oil and the pigment together until the pigment's completely saturated. The idea being that you don't want to make the paint too runny. And so now with the dry and wet ingredients mixed together, you can take a muller and grind them together. Now this process that I'm speeding up takes about 15 minutes. And what I'm doing is I'm listening and feeling for the grit of the pigment. When that has vanished and it's nice and velvety, then I know the paint is ready to work. Once you've ground the paint sufficiently, you simply collect everything that you've made together into a puddle, and you have your first bit of paint. Now, while it might not look like much, usually what you're making is a concentrate that you can dilute with more oil when it's time to apply. So this small puddle of paint will go a lot farther than you expect. So there you have it, 18th Century Paintmaking 101.